Welcome, everybody, to the post-game show here on our Crimson Tide on AL.com page. I am Matt Scalisi, joined here by Ben Flanagan, who is in Tuscaloosa, and got a little sense for what the game day atmosphere was like today in Tuscaloosa. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Definitely different experience than what most home games have looked like in the past for those of us used to going down there for games. But Ben, before we get into that stuff, let's talk about this game. 52-24 final score for Alabama. Nick Saban just absolutely not interested in showing any mercy on his former assistant, Jimbo Fisher.
Well, the streak is on the line, right? Where he's undefeated against his former assistants. What does he play? Like 4 in the next 4 weeks, including this week, starting with Jimbo Fisher. And obviously he absolutely stomped him. He was still throwing bomb passes in the fourth quarter when the game was well out of reach, which was interesting to say the least. But yeah, I mean, Saban is usually, including last week against Missouri, very conservative in the fourth quarter. So I thought it was kind of telling, or maybe they were just playing football. I don't know, but I thought it was kind of strange that they were still throwing those bomb passes. Another one for John Mechie, who was the breakout star of the game.
And some of that honestly might just be that that's what this offense is. You know, I mean, if you're trying to continue to keep a possession going in this game, that's what defenses are giving this Alabama offense right now. And I mean, you look at the numbers really both weeks now for Alabama. I think if you wanted to be really picky, you could look at it and say, hey, those rushing yards don't look too spectacular. But I mean, they don't need it. It's completely unnecessary to the offense right now. Mac Jones threw for 435 yards today, 4 touchdowns. He did have an interception, kind of a weird play that got batted away in front of him and picked off. But, 20 of 27, he was, again, I would say remarkably both efficient and explosive, if that's possible. Those are, it honestly doesn't look that different from how this offense operated under Tua.
Yeah, Alabama's offense is still very scary, and there were obviously concerns and questions about how do you replace Tua, and we saw glimpses of it, obviously, with Mac Jones, who shined at many points during the 2019 season against Tennessee to an extent, but really against Arkansas and Auburn, and obviously in the Citrus Bowl against Michigan. He just picked up where he left off. He looks better than he was last year. So it should be no surprise to us, I guess, based on what we saw from him last year. But it should also be no surprise because of how surrounded he is with weapons. The wide receivers are amazing, obviously, with the 2 stars in Waddle and Devontae Smith. But obviously, you see, again, I mentioned before, the breakout star today, John Mechie. Plus, you've got an amazing offensive line, just a beefy offensive line that's giving him great pass protection. And the running backs, like you said, they're not as productive on the stat sheet, but they're really solid backs who obviously also block well. So Mac Jones just has a lot going for him in terms of protection and where he can send the ball. But, yeah, Alabama's offense is scary. I mean, they did well on third down, 5 of 10, 544 total yards. It's amazing. But, I mean, look, and I know we'll get to it, but I think that this great offense, as well-rounded and as explosive as it is, it can put the defense in some weird positions in terms of just playing way more than maybe they want to. Because, I mean, one of the telling stats of the game today is the time of possession, where Texas A&M had the ball for 37-plus minutes, whereas Alabama had it for 22 because they were just scoring so quickly. So we'll see if that's a problem for them moving forward, but you're not going to say no to points.
Absolutely not. And, I think that's another similarity that this team has with the offense under Tua is how fast they score. And it does sort of tax a defense. We've seen that in recent years, and Saban's talked about that, that it can be a burden on a defense to have to play that many snaps in a game. But it's really tough to know how to do it any other way. I mean, this team is so effective at passing the ball right now. I think there will be some further development probably in the ground game, but I think when you can put 50 points on the board, and that used to be kind of an unheard of thing for Alabama, Ben, in the 10 plus years that you and I have been sort of covering and being around this team. It used to be a thing that really only happened when Alabama would play an FCS opponent or an occasional otherwise cupcake level opponent. And it's now kind of becoming the norm for them to score that often. And really the only way that happens is you score quick. And they had a 70-plus yard touchdown today. They had another one over 60. I think both of Mechie's were pretty long touchdowns. So these things are just sort of the nature of this offense when you have wide receivers who can run this fast and beat guys on routes, and you have a quarterback who can get it to them. That's just how it's going to go. And I think the defense will suffer a little bit because of that. You're kind of the guy that I would say has spent more time digging into the mentality of the Alabama football fan base than anybody else I know, Ben. And you've done it on your podcast, Bammers, which I would encourage everybody to go and download and check out past episodes of that. Do you get a sense that Alabama fans are getting more used to seeing a scoreboard where they gave up 24 points and that not being that bad of a thing?
Yeah, I mean, look, fans were happy during the Tua era, right? When they were putting up all those points, it didn't really matter what anybody else scored because Alabama was going to outscore them. So the other team could get as many yards as they wanted to, but Alabama was always a threat to score on that play, right? Like you mentioned, Mechie's touchdowns and Waddle's touchdowns, they went for 78 yards each at one point. Like it just happens in a flash. I think Alabama scored on the first play several times of the game from scrimmage from like the 25-yard line several times during the Tua era. So it's exciting, it's entertaining, and it's going to thrill any fan base. But it's interesting that you said that this is kind of new for Alabama, and it definitely is. But, I mean, even during, like, the Mark Ingram days and the Trent Richardson days and the A.J. McCarron-led offenses, those were explosive offenses. They were a little more balanced, and they obviously had they were more focused on the run game than they have been, and they were putting up, upwards of, like, 39, 40 points a game at times. But this is different. It's way different. They're scoring in much higher volume, obviously. And so, yeah, it's super entertaining, but it definitely looks like a different type of Alabama team than we've seen in the recent past under Nick Saban.
And Patrick, our producer, dropping a nice stat underneath there that Mac Jones has 3 career passing touchdowns of 85-plus yards, which is the most of any quarterback in school history. So Mac already surpassing Tua in certain ways statistically. We'll see how it develops as the season goes on.
He's better. He's better than Tua. I think it's safe to say it at this point, Matt.
I will say, I think that the offense right now probably has more balance across the board than what we saw in the offenses that Tua was running, because I think that this is the best offensive line that Alabama has had in a number of years. I think they built up some talent and depth in that unit, and as long as they stay healthy, it's going to allow somebody like Mac to continue to put up these crazy numbers every week. And I think really the only question is who is going to be able to come in and challenge them, not necessarily by shutting down the Alabama offense, but by keeping pace with them. And we are going to see, I think next week could be an interesting challenge for Alabama. Lane Kiffin is a guy who obviously understands Steve Sarkisian. They know each other really well. And he's got a great offense at Ole Miss right now, I believe. And I haven't seen it since we started talking, but Ole Miss had taken a lead over Kentucky the last time I checked before we started here. So they've got a very explosive offense. They don't have a good defense, and Alabama is probably going to get more than their fair share of points in that game too. But I think that's the kind of matchup that I'm interested in seeing this team take on next, is not necessarily somebody who's got the talent to push the Alabama offense and challenge them in some way, but somebody who can actually keep pace and force that Alabama offense to have to keep their foot on the gas the whole game.
The last 2 times that it's happened, or not the last 2, because Alabama obviously lost to Auburn too, which was a really explosive offense that seemed to score however and whenever they wanted in the Iron Bowl. But that was after Tua went down, obviously. But I was going to say the last couple of times Tua lost, they were against high-powered offenses who had very talented defenses, and they also went on to win the national championship. Obviously, that was Clemson in the national championship game that was incredibly explosive. and so good against Alabama's defense in that national championship game. That was just a total disaster all across the board for Nick Saban's team. But then you look at LSU, obviously, with Joe Burrow. You have these two guys who are considered these generational quarterback prospects, and that seems to be, during Nick Saban's tenure at Alabama, sort of what it takes. If it's not just an insane day by a guy who's just clicking on all cylinders, I'm thinking of people like Steven Garcia, obviously in 2010 with South Carolina, and there have been some other guys. Obviously, the Ole Miss quarterbacks, when Hugh Freeze beat Alabama 2 years in a row, those guys just had lights-out games against Alabama. But you think back on like Cam Newton, obviously in the second half of that Iron Bowl, and then Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow. It takes really special guys leading those offenses with really talented players to beat a Nick Saban defense, even if that defense isn't as talented as past Nick Saban defenses have been, because they've just had to outscore these Tua-led offenses. And now Mac Jones seems to be doing the exact same thing. So we'll see.
Well, no Johnny Manziel for Texas A&M this year, so they go down fairly easily in this game.
Him too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, Ben, I do want to get to the atmosphere in Tuscaloosa today because you were there shooting photos. This is what you normally do for AL.com on game days. You're there kind of chronicling the sights and sounds of what's going on both inside and outside the stadium. This is a very unique situation that you've never seen, and you grew up in Tuscaloosa. You know what game days look like there. Tell us a little bit about what surprised you, what sort of stood out to you about what campus looked like today compared to normal. I mean, we obviously know way less people know tailgating, but anything kind of particularly jump out as strange to you?
Well, I think the biggest question I had going into it was what would be the mask situation, right? Like, would everybody be wearing masks? Would it be kind of loosey-goosey before the game? Because, I mean, if anybody wanted to get into Bryant-Denny Stadium, they were going to have a mask. And if they didn't have one, then Bryant-Denny was going to give them a mask on their way through the gate. So I was interested to see that. I would say, just from eyeballing it, and this is obviously not a reliable stat here, but I would say just from walking around and seeing people and taking photos of people, it was about 50-50. Right. And there's a mask there.
Incredible photo right there.
Yeah. By a Forrest Gump impersonator on the Walk of Champions. I was just standing there talking to another photographer, and up runs this Forrest Gump impersonator. But anyway, it was obviously, and you can see from most of these photos that the crowds were small, and it was designed that way, right? There's going to be 20% capacity in Bryant-Denny Stadium all season, but it was still surreal to go to the Quad. That's the first place I went after I walked down the Strip, which was relatively crowded, including a lot of bars and restaurants that had a lot of customers, both masked and unmasked. Obviously, to drink and eat, you have to take your mask off, but people who are waiting in lines to get inside of the bars and the restaurants, most of them were masked, but I did see a lot of people without them. But yeah, going to the Quad, it was empty. And again, tailgating is banned in 2020. And for obvious reasons, it's understandable. They don't want people congregating in large gatherings on the Quad and elsewhere on campus to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So again, everybody gets it and understands it. It's a bummer that there won't be tailgating this year, but it's to protect everybody. And so you get it. But yeah, it was still strange because it was empty other than people just sort of sauntering across to get from point A to point B. But the crowd kind of built up, I guess, closer to when they held the Walk of Champions, which they still held. Actually, that was a question that I had, is how's that going to go? Because usually that's a big fan event each and every home game, where fans flank the side of the brick walkway that the players walk once they get off the bus and head into Bryant-Denny Stadium. And this year they roped off those lawns that surround that brick walkway, and that sort of prevented people from getting on those lawns, but they ended up sort of covering the four corners of that sort of rectangle heading into Bryant-Denny Stadium in very much smaller groupings. And again, about half and half when it came to masks. But the entire team and the coaching staff and everybody with Alabama, they were all masked as they went into the stadium. So it was an interesting sight to see, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Yeah, well, hopefully everybody stays safe tonight. Who's in Tuscaloosa? Please behave responsibly. Please wear your mask. We don't want to see this thing spread any further than it already has. And we will have a lot more for you guys here on the Facebook page where you're watching this. We'll have Nick Saban's press conference later. We will have more photos from Ben from the sights and sounds of Tuscaloosa today. I'll also remind everybody, go check out the podcast Bammers. It's available wherever you can find podcasts. Really, really great, compelling, interesting deep dive into Alabama football culture. And Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. And we're going to play everybody out with a look at what it was like in the stadium today in Tuscaloosa. So thanks again for joining us, Ben.
Sure. Thank you.